You know, I have no idea how to paint leather.
How to paint leather. A step-by-step guide.
I'm gonna use YouTube to make the YouTube. Alright, so I had seen this comment a while back, and I agree with it to a certain point. I do agree that the book should be in better condition. However, looking at the journal itself, it's not holding up all that well. I don't think it should be as bad as Journal 3, but it's definitely not in a clean condition. So the way I think I'm going to portray that is actually making this journal slightly red, but keeping the color pretty close, because I still have to make sure it looks plausible that Journal 3 is still the same journal, just heavily damaged. Feels like the acetone's burning my hands. It's even the point of these gloves. Seeing as Journal 3 was out in the forest, inside a box, gathering dust, bugs, based on that, we can also assume it's possible it got some type of water damage. That's why the leather on Journal 3 would be a lot darker than Journal 1, because Journal 1 would have been in a nice air-conditioned basement. Why does this one have a stick and the other one doesn't? They look like the same product. And so the leather wouldn't have gotten further damaged than from when Ford had gave it to Stan. But it's not like he gave him the journal in perfect condition. The thing was already falling apart. So I'm going to try to make Journal 1 just slightly better, as in better condition than Journal 3. And the way I'm going to show it is the metal's not going to be corroded as bad, the leather's going to be in a little bit better condition. The tears though, however, are going to be in worse condition than Journal 3. Seeing how there's a giant chunk missing from the book, it kind of is in worse condition, in some ways. So when you start your journal, go ahead and use a deglazer, and this will get rid of all that finish on top of that leather. If you don't get rid of that finish on top, the paint's not going to really have anything to stick to. And it's very likely that it's going to crack and kind of scratch off really easily. So go ahead and remove that finish and then start using a leathered paint. And here are the two paints that I'm using for my journal. I think it's called Angelus. So it's Angelus Scarlet Red and Angelus Brown. And I'm also using a little bit of a thickener from the same brand. Realistically, you can use any brand of your choosing. This just happens to be the one that I picked up. And since I haven't really painted any other leather projects, this is really my only recommendation I have right now. And I would take that with a grain of salt because this is still a fairly new project, so I don't know how well it's going to hold up over time. But I do recommend some type of flexible paint because if you use like a regular acrylic, that will crack on you as it moves. I do know that one from experience. I tried painting shoes at one point with just regular store-bought acrylic, and let me tell you, that thing cracked almost immediately. So while I let this journal dry outside, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the metal bits. And I'm going to be showing you a different trick this time around. So you can always freehand this onto the actual brass itself with a Sharpie, or you can actually print this out and cut it out, and then using some double-sided tape, you can actually just stick it straight onto the brass. Both methods have a little bit of a downside. If you're using a Sharpie, you're going to have to end up cleaning that off afterwards. And if you use this method right here where you're just taping it on, it is a little bit of a pain to take off. It might just be the brand of tape I'm using, but I find that it is quite difficult to remove, especially since there's a bunch of sharp edges afterwards. So for the hand, I'm going to be using an 18 gauge plate of brass. Don't forget to wear your safety goggles. I've had metal fling at my face. And I'm going to be using a pair of 20 gauge snips. Even though it's not rated to cut 18 gauge, I find with a little bit of elbow grease it does still cut. And then right here you are going to see how difficult it is to remove that paper. Now I'm sure if you use a thicker paper it would come off a little bit easier, but that tape still kind of sticks really well. For the corner protectors, I'm just going to be tracing on an old template that I had, and I'm going to be using a 30 gauge plate of brass for this. You can see just a regular pair of kitchen scissors can cut this really easily. So if you do want to do this project, I do recommend using that 30 gauge as it's a lot easier to use. But in my case, I already used that 18 gauge plate of brass, so I am going to have to keep that consistency throughout the 3 journals. Now, given the chance to do the project all over again, would I switch the gauge? Probably not. It does add quite a bit of weight to the journal, and it makes it feel a little bit more authentic in a way. Now, obviously in the show, it's just like a piece of foil that's on top of the journal glued down, but just something about the book being heavier makes it just feel a little bit more real. So after I've sanded everything down, I'm going to go ahead and clean up my station. And just make sure to clean up your station really well. If you've ever had metal shavings in your hand, it's not fun. For the rivets, I'm just going to be using these metal pins, and I always make sure to cut mine inside some type of bag, that way the needle doesn't just fly around. There's a reason we're doing this on the floor. And grab that spare table leg you have hanging around, and we're going to use that to flatten out the metal. Now I'm just going to be doing this on bare concrete, because 1, it's going to give really natural scratches, and 2, I just don't have anywhere else to put this. As far as the little rivets, just a little bit of taps. This will just help give it a more organic look. It'll also help flatten out the needle in the back, making it much easier to glue down. So now that we took the time to flatten that out, let's go ahead and draw in the number 1, and I'm just going to be using a regular acrylic. Now the acrylic will come off super easy, so you will have to use some type of finish just to keep it in place. Now using my paper clip, I'm just going to scratch it up just a little bit, just to give the illusion of it being damaged. Afterwards, we're going to go ahead and corrode the metal just a little bit. Can't let my eternal coffee go to waste, not in this economy. Now, I don't have too many containers that I can rust this metal, so I am going to have to just put this off to the side for now. And if you don't know what I'm using this for, I'm using it to damage all the Polaroids. So now that we have a clean container, let's go ahead and put a generous amount of salt. And when I mean generous, I mean put a lot of salt in here. When we add that vinegar, all the fumes in there is actually what's going to cause that corrosion to the metal. You don't need to make too much of this mixture, just enough to fill the bottom of the container. Now, depending on the effect that you want, if you actually have the metal touching the vinegar, you'll get a very strong corrosion, but if you have it just sitting inside the fumes, you'll just get a little bit of tint. And I did go back and forth if I wanted the metal to be really clean or not, but I decided if the book is in such bad condition, I can't imagine the metal being in any better condition. I'm just gonna let that cook for an extra 20 minutes. It does have a little bit of a green patina to it, but that can be easily washed off. You do, however, want to do that while it's still fresh, because it does tend to stick afterwards. By the way, that lid that I'm using right there is just a coffee lid. And I am going to be saving it because I am going to be using that plate for all the epoxy I'm going to be using later down. So let's go ahead and clean off the container, and then we can return the eternal coffee back to it. Now, could I easily just replace the coffee and throw a new one in there? Yeah, probably. So you might think at this point I should probably stop corroding this, but in my opinion it's still a little too nice, so I'm going to add a little bit of gouache paint on top of it, and this is going to act like a little bit of mud. And this will just give a little bit more for the eye to look at. So while we wait for that to dry, let's go ahead and start working on the journal itself. So now that the paint's dry, let's go ahead and start weathering this book and start damaging it. And for this, I'm just going to be using a metal file. I find it works really well at scratching the leather, but not actually cutting into it. I don't necessarily like to cut into the leather, because then it makes it really easy for it to be damaged. Especially if it got exposed to some type of water, because then the cardboard inside would just soak it up immediately, and it's really difficult to dry it. So let's go ahead and finish off cutting into the journal, and then for the edges, just so that they're not so nice, I'm going to use a pair of scissors just to mangle it up a little bit. That way it doesn't look like such a manufactured cut, and it'll give it a much more organic look. And because right now we have exposed cardboard, I'm going to be using super glue as a sealer, and this will do two things. One, it's going to protect the cardboard and it's going to reseal that leather, and two, it's going to give it a really thick weathering look and almost give it like a burned look. And you can see right there that I'm using the lid of the super glue because super glue doesn't stick to it. So it makes it a really good reusable paintbrush, even though it's not a brush. So right here I'm just going to clean off my station just so that all that leather particles don't fly everywhere. And just starting with a clean surface makes it much easier to work with. So for this part, I'm going to be adding extra weathering now. Now I could leave it at this stage, but I like mine to be a little bit more distressed. This is just a personal preference though. And I'm just going to be mixing a little bit of that Angelus brown with a little bit of airbrush black. And then I'm also going to be using that to add that stain in the back of the book. And I'm trying to keep those colors really nice and subtle. I don't want anything looking too cartoony here. You can see right here I did try to spill some of that paint on there, and it didn't really stick at all, honestly. But that's just because I'm keeping the paint really watered down. So now that all that paint's down, all of it's dried, I'm going to be using a Rust-Oleum matte clear spray. And that'll just lock down all the changes that we've made so far. For the gluing process, epoxy worked really well for Journal 3, so I'm going to be using that for Journal 1 as well. And just make sure that when you're using an epoxy that you have it in a well ventilated area, because it does have quite a bit of a smell. Make sure that you're mixing the epoxy enough, because if you don't mix it enough, the epoxy just won't cure and it'll stay kind of sticky. The epoxy I'm using does have a really quick dry time, but do make sure to take the time to actually mix it. Now, learning from Journal 3, I know now not to try to glue everything down at once, because I did have multiple pieces sliding around while they were drying. Nope, that's sliding. And it's just more peace of mind knowing that certain pieces aren't moving anymore. In my case, I don't have to worry about the center hand moving at all. And I can place my full attention onto these corner protectors. Now I am wasting a lot more epoxy this time around, but this is a lot easier knowing that nothing's going to slide around, especially here when I have the book on its side. The gold wraparounds, I don't have to worry about anything sliding, like the previous journal. Now because the stain on the back of the book doesn't really show up all that well, I think if I use a gloss varnish, it'll show up a little bit easier, especially when the light catches it. Now for all the hanging pieces of leather, I'm just going to be taking a little chunk off the spare journal, and we're going to be gluing that onto Journal 1. Because I don't actually want to cut into Journal 1 itself, but we do still need those hanging leather pieces. So for that little scrap piece of leather, I'm just going to be cutting it up with a pair of scissors, just to give it more of an organic tear look. And once I got a look that I like, I'm going to go ahead and glue that onto the actual journal with a little bit of super glue and just fold it onto itself. Now the back flap is supposed to be hanging downwards, but I don't want it getting caught on anything, so I'm just going to have it glued upwards. That way it's still included, but it's not going to be getting caught on anything. And so that we can blend this hand into the journal a little bit more, I'm going to outline it with a little bit of black paint. That way it looks like mud got stuck between the fingers. Now for this little shape in the front, I thought it was a piece of leather that was probably ripped off and then glued back on, but the shape does look a lot like the symbol on the back of Journal 3, and as you know, in the official Journal 3, it doesn't have that black line, it's more of a bleached look. So to keep the consistency, I'm going to make sure it looks the same as well here. And so this is my rendition of Journal 1. Now I could be wrong on a couple things, but I like how it came out. And I think it matches Journal 3 really well, where they look similar, but not quite the same. They look like they've gone through their own adventure separately. So when I was doing my research for Journal 1, I noticed that gnome page is inside Journal 1, and if you take a closer look, he actually drew it in twice. I don't think Journal 1's about mushrooms. I think it's about gnomes.